specifically. Tell folks the case for juniper mitigation, and I want to ask you to debate both sides of the issue, because I'm just purely because I'm curious. There's a lot of juniper removal that happens in Oregon too, so it's a personal subject. But you said getting managing junipers and pinions, which is a pinyon pine, I assume that you're speaking of, to restore winter habitat. Were those juniper and pinions not there at some point? Like, are they invasive? Like, what's the story there?
Yeah, so if you go back in time and you look at kind of the heyday of mule deer, and when mule deer were the most prolific and habitat conditions were, the best, it was at a time when we had heavy sheep, heavy grazing across the West. And essentially what we were doing was we were creating an early succession community. So you had grasses and forbs that were coming up, and then you were also, kind of retaining shrubs. And since we've also removed, grazing largely off the landscape, and then also fire. So fire, we used to burn a lot, right? And we kind of went away from burning. Especially over probably the last 50, 60 years, we really reduced the number of burns. And if a burn starts, we typically put it out pretty quick if we can. Right. Which has allowed pinyon and juniper to expand. And it's if you've ever been out in a juniper forest, it can become a monoculture pretty quick. So essentially what it does is it sucks up all the water, light, resources, and it creates a layer of that duff, and it essentially eliminates everything else in the understory. So the first things to go typically are your grasses, your forbs, and then your shrubs like bitterbrush, sagebrush, which are things that are, primarily food items for mule deer in the winter. They go after, and then, they don't come back because those pinyon and juniper, it's a monoculture. It just creates that layer of duff, puts down seed every year, outcompetes for sunlight and water, and pretty soon you've pretty much lost all your winter range. And so when I worked for the DWR, a lot of what we were doing at that time was removing pinyon and juniper. And we you try to do it. It provides cover for deer. Deer also eat some juniper. But for the most part, the most quality, or how would I say it, the kind of the habitat feature that juniper provides for deer is cover. And so we would try to create a mosaic, a nice layout of a landscape where you still retain some cover, but you also opened up a bunch of ground for the establishment of early successional vegetation, which is what deer prefer and do well on.
And how do you guys remove is it just literally just cutting them down, or is there controlled burns, or how does that work?
So there's primarily three methods. Lop and scatter is one, and you're from Oregon. Oregon has these huge lop and scatter crews that we would often contract, and those guys would come down, and essentially what it is just an army of guys with chainsaws, and they'll go through and they'll cut, lop, and scatter. So they'll lop all the limbs off, and then they'll cut the tree into foot-long sections and just essentially drop that thing down. That's one way to do it. That one's not nearly as effective because you're not creating any kind of disturbance in the soil. So you're not turning over the soil to create any kind of seed bed. That works pretty well, lop and scatter, if you have a decent understory already. If you've still got some grasses and forbs, and you've still got some browse species like sagebrush or bitterbrush, it'll come back with a lop and scatter if you have that. But if you don't, and you kind of need to bring that back and rejuvenate that from essentially from the jump, you've got to create some sort of disturbance in the soil, which is the other two methods which they use most is chaining. So they'll take 2 D10 cats, and they'll take a giant anchor chain with, big old links about yay big, and they'll have a cross section welded to it. And they've got a swivel on each end, and essentially what they'll do is those 2 cats will drive along, and they'll just pull all the trees down as they go. And as they do that, it creates, disturbance in the soil. Plus, you're pulling out all those trees, so you're creating a seed bed or a seed source there for new vegetation. And then probably the other one that we've been using a lot is they call it a bull hog. So it's like a cat with a head on it. It's got like a boom. It's got this spinning drum with teeth welded on it. And essentially what they'll do is they'll take that and drop it down on the tree, and it just masticates it, just chews it up. And that's really good because it creates a layer of duff on the landscape. And what you can do is you can go through and seed prior to those treatments. And then that duff layer is going to retain moisture, and then also it's going to eliminate, some of the competition. So like cheatgrass is a big thing, and you can establish cheatgrass pretty quick, but that duff layer will actually kind of keep that cheatgrass from establishing and give your native species that you seeded a chance to grow.